on. Okay. So I would like to firstly thank you for sitting down with us and giving us your very valuable time to answer these questions. Obviously, a lot of conversation has been happening with the election of Donald Trump. I actually originally planned this to be before the election, but I think this interview will probably be a bit more informed, a bit more detailed after the results have actually come out now. So I guess the first question is, I mean, how has he actually pulled this off? I mean, it's been nothing short of a remarkable political comeback. And I'll stick to the facts. Obviously, he has been alleged of a many amount of things, but I'm sure as you've seen the Vanity Fair cover that was published after he was elected, in which it listed 34 felony counts, 1 conviction, 2 cases pending, 2 impeachments, 6 bankruptcies, and 4 more years of Donald Trump as president of the United States. He's not just won the Electoral College, but after being rejected 4 years ago, he's also won the popular vote. And many people, well, I suppose inside America, but a lot of people outside of America are asking, how has he done it? How has this happened?
Absolutely. I suppose the first thing that I would say is, well, first of all and foremost, thank you so much for the invite to participate. I'm very happy to be here talking with you. In terms of the outcome and the extent of the win, it is stunning. And I think whatever one's opinion or whatever one's hopes might have been, or all of the punditry beforehand, guessing and second guessing how things might have turned out. I think there were very, very few people who saw the victory being as resounding as it actually is. So that is to be assuming everything was free, fair, and procedurally appropriate, and one hopes that it was. It was a phenomenal feat. So in terms of you mentioned the Vanity Fair cover, I suppose my instinctive response to that is that all of these things are so common knowledge. They've been so out there in the ether now for such a long time, although some of them are rolling and developing stories. Everyone is aware. So I don't think that they would have made that much difference, in the sense that if Trump was your man, you were going to support him anyway. And if he wasn't, you were going to, avoid him and be quite against him anyway. There were a number of undecideds in this election, perhaps more so than last time around, which is surprising in a way because the country is so divided. But I suppose maybe if we're to take positives out of this, perhaps, is that if there was a reasonable cohort of undecideds, it meant that people were actually still thinking and maybe making rational decisions, rather than just being down their silos and voting completely on their emotions, which I think a lot of people would have.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think when the results were announced and you see who were undecided, especially in the minorities, there was a huge increase. But I think overall, it just took everyone by surprise. So I suppose one can't know exactly how and why he won it, but just from looking from the results, as I said, it's just been a remarkable political comeback, the likes that I think is probably fair to say that America has really seen. I do want to just touch on obviously his second term, because there's been a lot of questions of how it's going to look, when compared to its first term, not mentioning, things like Project 2025 and his appointments, which we'll get onto later. But just in general, overall, how do you think this time is going to differ from last time?
Yeah, it's the question of the moment, isn't it? It's so hard to know. I mean, I can't pretend to know. So that's the first sort of a disclaimer, I suppose, because normally, if you had somebody returning to politics, or somebody winning a second term, or maybe somebody who'd left and came back, I'm thinking, Richard Nixon, was vice president for 8 years. He lost in 1960. He was, very publicly stating that he was done with politics and he was going to the private sector. He makes a comeback some years later, wins the presidency, etc. So generally speaking, when you're dealing with a conventional politician, you can make some assumptions based on previous, because they have form in certain areas and whatever.
Yeah.
With Trump, we do have 4 years to draw on, but because he is so unpredictable and so unique, and that is a lot of his attraction to a lot of his supporters. For academia, it's a massive headache, because we tend to like putting things in boxes and drawing patterns and making assumptions on previous. We just can't do that with him. So I suppose, having said all that, I'll try and just maybe come up with a couple of possible ways that perhaps this might roll out. I think Trump too is going to be really quite different, and there's probably maybe two reasons for that. One is to do with those that he has around him, and we'll get onto that in a while in terms of the staffing choices and that. But back in 2016, when he came in, he was the sort of circumstances and staffing, I suppose, would be the two ways in which things might noticeably change. 2016, he was the new guy. There is so much evidence to suggest and show that his own team and really possibly himself did not anticipate the victory. Okay, so that's a very different starting point to this time, where they were really quite confident of victory, and as it turned out, rightly so. So the circumstances are very different. And then the second thing, in relation to the staffing and knowing how things work and who you want to put in there, he's well ahead of himself or his team, I suppose I should say, are well ahead of themselves in this regard. So he has the experience of the past, and now he may want to do things differently. Obviously, for Liberals, it's quite a frightening time. I think that's probably not an overstatement. I would say perhaps maybe one thing to consider, and I'm very interested in this, although it's only pure conjecture at this point, like the extent to which he will be thinking about and mindful of his place in the history books. You don't tend to be thinking about that so much on day one of term one, but as he gets towards the end of term two, I mean, I know it hasn't started yet, but he'll be thinking about that. And so, just does he want to be the statesman, or does he want to always be the kind of the rule breaking, norm busting guy? So it remains to be seen, but I think a different flavor this time around.
Okay. And we'll get onto the appointments, as I say. So Trump's cabinet appointments, obviously, they have to be, it's pending approval, of course. But so far, we have, amongst others, the first female chief of staff, history making, of course. Matt Gaetz was just announced late last night as Attorney General, which took many by surprise, I think. The most striking, however, is Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Going to be heading, if they are approved, a new government department, which is the Department of Government Efficiency, rather. And I just want to get your general opinion on the appointment so far. But in terms of that new government department, their job is to slash bureaucracy, cut costs, etc., etc. Now, I know that's very difficult to do in countries like Ireland and the UK, where my mind cast back to Liz Truss, for example, who ran on a platform of cutting, Whitehall bureaucracy, etc., but wasn't able to do that because all the civil servants there are permanent and pensionable. But do you think this is actually something Trump can pull off? And what do you think the consequences of having Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, who controls one of the biggest social media platforms in the world, in government?
Yes, I have to say I haven't actually gotten my head around the prospect of Elon Musk being in the administration. Of course,
I don't think
it's not
many people have.
I can't quite rationalize it or imagine how it's going to roll out yet, because he is, we know what he's like. Anybody, I mean, you don't even have to be on Twitter X
No.
to get a sense of how he is. He's very present in the culture, in the mainstream culture now, and for a whole range of reasons, whether you've bought his cars or you just see him online or whatever. In terms of setting up this particular new department, I suppose there's maybe a couple of things to that. One is that it is a sort of a personification, or he and the department will be a personification of taking a kind of a business approach to running the country. So rather than this, you know, kind of more conventional way that we might be used to, with the
Yeah.
pensionable civil service and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
That they're talking about kind of tearing up the rule book to a certain extent. Now Trump did say these very similar things in 2016 in terms of slashing various departments. I mean, that would be a kind of quite a classic Republican take in terms of, the Department of Education is always the one that gets it in the neck. They all want to abolish that. No one ever does. This is slightly different because it's setting up an actual new department, which in a way, there's a contradiction in terms there, because to set it up, that's a monumental undertaking in itself. I'm thinking of George W. Bush set up the Department of Homeland Security back in the day after 9/11.
Yeah.
They started out by recruiting 180,000 new staff. So that's a thing. If he's going to set
Big
up a
task.
department, there's people and resources.
Yes.
One other thing I would say in relation to this, to me, in terms of the danger that comes with this kind of stuff, I understand it's throwing red meat to the base. It's giving Elon a platform that many people will be delighted to see him taking his business prowess into the public sector. But for me, what I would say is, and I can't stress how kind of important I think this is. Any responsible democracy, the government needs to have as a fairly high priority, I think, planning for distant risk. Okay. Now, generally speaking, Western democracies are okay at that. They're not great, but they're good enough. When Trump came in 2016, he wanted to slash the deep state down to, the bone. He made some inroads into that. What happens? COVID happens. And next thing, when there is a global emergency, the deep state is a kind of handy thing to have
Yeah.
in terms of
Yeah.
institutional knowledge and all of that kind of stuff. So that would be my big fear, that they actually get further down the road of dismantling things in order to promote efficiency. And then the next time there is a challenge of whatever sort, that the resources and the expertise won't be there.
And it's interesting that you present that concern that I'm sure many people share, and it actually ties into the next question about Project 2025. Now, obviously, Trump has distanced himself from this, but it has been published and edited and written by many of his former and current inner circle, and it's a bit of a two-headed question, and it's a very, very fully loaded one. But it's a question that a lot of people are asking: are we seeing the end of American democracy as we know it? Considering there's been it's been a mantra that a lot of Kamala Harris, her vice president pick, and her fans have been saying, fight for the democracy. This is the election to decide for democracy. And it also ties in with a reader's question about how much democratic malaise, how has so much democratic malaise happened in the US. So my overall question is, do you think these things are a real concern, or do you think it's a more kind of over dramatic tone that some people are taking with it?
It's hard to know. If you take everything that is being said at the moment at face value, and you read, if you have time on your hands, read the 900 pages from the Heritage Foundation, which is what makes up Project 2025. If you're of any kind of liberal persuasion, and I would also say any kind of traditionally conservative persuasion, so that is a different entity, mindset, and group now to what I would call the MAGA Republican Party. Okay, there's different categories there. I would certainly be very concerned, but to just sort of balance it out in the grand scheme of things, I would say a couple of things. I mean, the Heritage Foundation have been around for many decades. They have been writing mandates for leadership since, I'm going to say, the 1980s, probably, kind of the Reagan era. There's been a lot of talk about making radical transformations. They are what we would consider to be a right-wing think tank. So, different staffing over the years has kind of tilted it maybe further to the right at different points or whatever. It's pretty far to the right at the moment. There's no doubt about that. But I think, even bearing in mind that that the Republicans have had such a clean sweep now, just even since today. We know that they've taken over the House of Representatives,
Yeah.
or they have from January, as well as the Senate, as well as the White House. I mean, this is a monumental array of power they have at their disposal. But I would say that in the end, trying to get things done, like trying to bring sort of, monumental, radical change, it is still quite a slow process in a functioning democracy, and America still is that. So I wouldn't be having the panic that certain maybe media outlets and that are kind of promoting. I don't think it's useful, and I don't think it's quite accurate.
Okay. Okay. We will touch on the Democratic Party. Obviously, they're going to have a lot of soul searching to do after this election. As you've just mentioned, they've, not controlling the House, not controlling the Senate, and obviously not controlling the presidency. The Republicans have the trifecta that they so strongly wanted. But there seems to be sort of, at least in the media, what they're saying is some sort of a power vacuum. Obviously, Biden stepped down to make way for Harris to run for president. Harris, obviously, as we know, did not win, and Biden will be leaving the White House in January. So, who do you think will fill it, and where does this leave the Democratic Party now?
Yeah, well, just the answer to the very end of your question there is in the wilderness for the time
Yeah,
being,
yeah,
without any question. They are in a kind of a difficult situation in the sense that, I mean, they're stalwarts of recent times. The Nancy Pelosi's, the Joe Bidens, all of those. The elder statesmen and women. They are really elderly now, and their power and their time in office and sort of in control is waning, as is, they've had a good run, so
yeah.
that's fine. You think of the kind of the younger, the AOCs, that sort of generation, they're still too young yet, for the kind of, that, again, somebody like her who's kind of very high profile and very well regarded within that realm. She's too young yet to be sort of, having her eyes on any kind of bigger prizes. But there is a dearth at the moment, in terms of who might fill the kind of the space and the vacuum. What I would like to think is that, thinking about 28, as one does, that there are probably a number of individuals out there, of Democrats out there, that we don't even know their names at
Yeah,
this point. They are not getting traction beyond. They might be in, well known in their own areas and whatever, but we don't know them yet. So by the time we get maybe 2026 midterms, that would be a time where certain names start to be bandied around, with the view to 2028 and contenders. But I think we literally don't know who they are yet. But they'll have to be found and, kind of promoted and supported and all of that. And the party needs to, I mean, the soul searching, I think the blame game is not a very useful thing. There's lots of, Biden should have gone sooner and whatever. I don't think their problem is a Biden problem, and I don't think their problem is a Harris problem. Their problem is a messaging and an outreach problem. And now they have a class problem as well. Okay, because traditionally they were the party of the working class. They're really not anymore. They appeal to academics and people on kind of high incomes who've got 2, possibly 3 degrees, that kind of thing. They need to really think about their traditional appeal back to the kind of blue collar support of yesteryear. So loads for them to think about.
yeah.
And that just sort of speaking to each other and over relying on the fact that they were not Trump or they were not Trumpists, it just wasn't enough in the end.
Mm. Um, I suppose we'll turn to a reader's question. It somewhat relates. A reader has asked, is this the end of an opportunity for a female president, or at least for the time being? Because a lot of chatter, whether you believe it or not, and whether it's true or not, is that the fact that Harris was a woman and a woman of color fed into certain people voting for a Trump win. But yeah, do you believe that this is the end, for the time being at least, for a female president?
Yes, good question. I think it would probably be on the back burner for a little while,
Yeah.
certainly. I mean, there's a couple of things there. I mean, we had Hillary Clinton in 2016. We had Hillary Clinton in 2008, actually, before Obama,
Hmm.
beat her in the primaries. There was a real sense of inevitability for her in 2008 before Obama came along. And so that was a kind of an internal Democrat competition, if you like. So that didn't even get out into the wider realm
Yeah.
of giving people the choice. In 2016, again, there was way too much assumption that she was going to, and especially because she was against Trump and everybody just kind of thought that he was like the kind of the protest candidate. No one
Mm.
took him seriously as an actual potential winner. And at the time when she lost, so much of the soul searching was, oh, she didn't lose because she was a woman, she lost because she was Hillary Clinton. And it's like, well, yeah, but those are two sides of the same coin. And now this time around, we have Harris. It's a little bit premature to start making meaningful conclusions about all the reasons why she lost. But I mean,
Hmm.
she lost in part for sure because she was a woman of color. And I mean, already the statistics are starting to kind of come out, all being little tributaries and little bits and pieces. But she did not do well, for example, or nowhere near as well as her party might have hoped with groups like Latino men. And,
Hmm.
in the end, they weren't comfortable with voting for a woman of color. And
Hmm.
they went and voted for Trump because he's the strong man. He's the guy who says that, he's going to fix the economy. And I learned, a lot from this particular situation last week as well, in terms of I would have made more generalized and clearly inaccurate assumptions about, the ways that recent immigrants might have voted, as in kind of maybe assuming that they would be more Democrat leaning, which they are to
Yeah.
some extent, but not to all the extent. And the idea that, the southern border is a very, very, very thorny political challenge for whoever's in
Hmm.
power. A lot of immigrant Americans, as in historically immigrant Americans, were not comfortable with what the Democrats were offering. So again, Trump gets votes there that I would not have anticipated. So there's a complicated set of kind of variables there in terms of when will we see a kind of a viable female candidate again? Perhaps not for a while, and it might be maybe that when we do see one, it'll be on the Republican side.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. And the final reader's question till I know we're pushed half the time, so it's just the last two questions anyway here. And I found this question quite interesting from one of our readers because when you imagine Trump, you imagine him as a bit of a show off, very charismatic, eccentric type of guy. Um, why do you think Trump isn't, I suppose, celebrating his win as much as we would possibly assume? And I was thinking about that myself, and I thought, well, you haven't really seen him do loads of press conferences, tweeting out loads of different things. Obviously, he's made his appointments, but he seems to be quite formal right now. Meeting with Biden, thanking
Biden,
him,
yeah.
however sincere that may be. But so why do you think he's not doing this kind of big bravado, strongman show off kind of thing now that he will be the next president?
Well, hmm, I think perhaps, and this is only conjecture, of course, but going back to the question from earlier where you asked about, how might he be different this time round than previous? I wonder, possibly, might this be a little taste of that, in the sense that, the any president at all is always, and like I said earlier, particularly as the time presses on and as they're into their second term, they're so mindful of the history books and how they will be perceived, and the extent to which, history, and I use that term broadly in terms of, students in classrooms in 30 years' time, and, basically anybody and any point, once the journalism of it is over and there's a kind of a pause, that's where you get into the history of, the event or the
Mm-hmm.
person, whatever.
Mm.
And I wonder, perhaps, is he more mindful now of how he is going to be perceived, because this is by most measures, probably going to be his last run. I mean, all his talk about, tearing up the Constitution and whatever, it's probably not actually going to happen. He probably is going to serve a 4-year term, and then, he will be in his early 80s, and hopefully his race will be run in every sense. So I can only sort of offer conjecture, but I think perhaps even, the thing of sitting down with Biden yesterday, he adhered to convention. Now, Biden adhered to convention by inviting him, of course, in the first place, but Trump adhered by accepting. This is a far, far less chaotic scenario than was playing out this time 4 years ago, when there was all the stolen election and, stop the steal and all of this narrative going on. Now, he can be afford to be more gracious because he won. But just even seeing the two of them sitting down, I mean, perhaps there were some gritted teeth, but he is always going to make himself out to be more of the bombast when the cameras are on than when they're not. And I suppose that's something to consider, that maybe he's just trying to look like the president he's going to be in another couple of months.
And my final question is a two-parter, and it involves Trump's, I suppose, relations outside of America, with the big talking points. So, on one hand, what does a second Trump presidency mean for, in your opinion, the European Union and NATO? Obviously, a lot of talk about the latter, about whether America will really pull out of NATO. And two, what does a second Trump presidency mean for the conflicts going on in the world right now, namely for Gaza and Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, okay, I'll take the first one first.
Yes.
In terms of what it means for international organizations, I mean, okay, you think about the America First mantra and mandate or whatever, which is, there's a kind of a, I don't know, I wouldn't dare to pretend to know how Trump would label himself, but generally speaking, there's an economic nationalist agenda to what he brings, and that's very attractive to a lot of voters because they're sick of spending taxpayer dollars on what they see as, kind of perhaps wasteful enterprises overseas and all of this kind of thing. I guess there's a few things. His rhetoric from the last time round was very much about increased burden sharing. I'm thinking of NATO in particular. And again, he was not the first president to bring that conversation to the table. And I mean, he had some valid points in that regard, in the sense that there wasn't equality in terms of the burden sharing and people stepping up to the plate and contributing X amount of GDP into the pot. So he did actually get some movement on that. And even his detractors have acknowledged that that was a positive, rather than everybody looking to the US to be the world's policeman, as they have really since, World War II. So I think over on this side of the Atlantic, and thinking about the EU perhaps in particular now, there's going to have to be some very blunt conversations about what the US is going to be offering anytime soon. And basically, Donald Trump is a very transactional individual. It sounds like it's going to be quite a transactional presidency with all the trade issues and the tariff threats and all the rest of it. So I think the EU is just going to have to sort of shape up and be mindful that America is not going to necessarily be the generous friend that it has been previously with that Trumpian 4 years, notwithstanding. In terms of the international conflicts, I mean, I can't say beyond knowing what he has said in terms of, ending the Ukraine war on day one. I mean, it sounds amazing. Wouldn't it be fabulous if that could magically happen?
Yeah,
but I mean, ending a war, you can say the words, but haven't necessarily heard any meaningful plans. I know he's talked about getting Putin on the phone and getting Zelensky on the phone and doing his Trumpian, he's known for his deal making, etc. It's difficult to tell. This isn't a business situation. This is, a death and horror and destruction. And we're coming up to the 3rd anniversary of that war, in the new year. So if he can do anything to end it in any constructive way, then great. But we all know that he's, got sort of a certain kind of unusual relationship with Putin, etc. So who knows what that might mean for Ukraine itself and its, territorial integrity, etc. with regard to Gaza, it's just very, very, very difficult to say. I think what we can deduce at this point, and again, it's all speculation and hypothetical, and I'm not a foreign policy expert at all, but the idea of those individuals that he will be putting into place in key roles of, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, these kinds of things, that is probably, those are the areas that we can deduce maybe where he's going to be coming from. And some of his potential staffers have very, very, very strong pro-Israeli stances. So, you can only imagine what that's going to mean for what's going on in Gaza and Lebanon at this point.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with us. We haven't know that was the final question anyway, but thank you so much for giving us your time and sitting down and speaking to us at Polity. Yes, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you for the invite, Ethan. Much appreciated.
Goodbye.